Thank you. So on this webinar, we've got a special guest with us today. So we've got Councillor Louise Krupski, who will be saying a few words in just a moment. And then we also have 3 of our Future Fit Homes team members. So that's myself. We've also got Nadia, who you've heard a moment ago. And then we've also got Hoji, who will be speaking in a short while. So first, Louise Krupski is going to be speaking, and she'll be talking about retrofit in Lewisham. And then I'll be giving a quick overview of why retrofit is important and what that means for landlords specifically. So Nadia will then talk to you about the guidance and also what landlords are required to do by law. And after this, I'll also talk you through some of the energy efficiency measures that you can make and what that means in your property. Lastly, Hoji will be talking you through what support's available, if there's any funding that might apply to you, and also how we can help at Future Fit Homes. So just as I mentioned earlier, we've got that Q&A right at the end, so we can work through your questions then. We're hoping to finish around 7:45, so we might as well get started. Louise, would you like to take over?
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone from Selce for inviting me back to speak. It's a real pleasure to help in any way I can with the great work you're doing to support our residents in Lewisham and to support the positive relationship the council has with your organisation. For those of you who don't know me, I am Louise Krupski and a Labour councillor for Lewisham. I am chair of the Sustainable Development Committee and therefore scrutinise the climate crisis work undertaken by the council. In the last year, I have also chaired what is called a Task and Finish Committee, which looks at a specific area of the council's work in detail to work out how it can be improved. I chose to work on housing retrofit as I saw it as being a key area of work that urgently needed to be addressed for us to fulfil our climate crisis targets. Just to let you know, we are now in the pre-election period, and so I can't share with you any materials produced by the council, and I have not had help to produce this speech by council officers. I'll be talking about the work I did that came to fruition last month on housing retrofit and what my committee recommended and how this might affect you. In 2019, I seconded the motion for Lewisham Council to declare a climate emergency in order that we should accelerate all measures necessary to get Lewisham to net carbon zero by 2030. The ambition is not just to ensure that all council-controlled activity is net zero, but all activity in the borough, which includes how we heat all our homes, both in the private sector and social housing. This, of course, is a mammoth task. And when we first started looking at this work last December, the rough calculation then was that 28 houses a day would have to be retrofitted, and that was over a year ago. When I started work on the housing retrofit piece, my main motivation was to try to push us more quickly to that goal. But over the course of doing this work, the motivation of both myself and all the committee changed to being it more a piece about fuel poverty and the urgent need for our residents to live in comfortable, cheaper to heat accommodation that did not suffer from damp and condensation. It is a cause of huge concern to all Lewisham Labour councillors that anyone in the borough must choose between feeding their families or themselves and heating their homes. Nearly 20% of our population in Lewisham live in fuel poverty, and this is set to escalate rapidly with the fuel cost hikes that have started and are going to increase. I'm sure this is also very concerning to you as landlords, as this will also inevitably have a downward pressure on rents, as residents simply will not be able to pay more while inflation and your costs are going to go up. With the government suggesting that all properties will need to be an EPC rating of C and above by 2025, retrofit will have to be on your radar. And if there's anything technical I'm saying in this speech now, please don't worry, because I know that the team, Selce team, will explain a lot of this stuff. So just bear with me if there's stuff that you don't understand. One of the recommendations of our committee was to look at how we can enforce the current EPC ratings more, as there are sadly many properties in Lewisham that are not up to standard. Lewisham won an award of £125,000 to boost engagement and enforcement work on the private rented sector, particularly looking at minimum energy efficiency standards. It is therefore hugely important that councils do everything they can to help landlords access help and support to be able to improve their properties. And this initiative between Selce and the council to access funding to start the process of retrofit through LAD funding is hugely welcome. So what else did we recommend the council do that is relevant to you? The most important thing is that a strategy needs to be put in place to describe a path towards net zero in 2030. I know this sounds really technical and not particularly helpful, but up to this point, the council had no clear roadmap for how to do it. And by agreeing to this, the council will have to commit more officer time and resources to working out how it's going to help people like you actually do the work we need to get done. We have recommended that by the end of this year, a one-stop shop for advice to residents and landlords be available online, explaining the technology, different steps that can be taken and in what order, from simple, easy measures such as draft proofing, right up to full retrofit and energy generation. We have also recommended that a new role of a retrofit coordinator be created, and this person could be used as a consultant on projects that needed specialist advice. We will, of course, continue to work with partners such as Selce, who already do some of this work. There will be no shortage of demand. We have recommended to our social housing providers a few things that could equally be applied to your own retrofit process. One is the importance of making tenants fully understand any new technology. If you install heat pumps in a property, many tenants will not necessarily understand that the heat is more ambient than radiant and may try to change settings which could upset the system or cost them more money than expected. This advice needs to be given every time you have a new tenant in your properties. It's also important to use any opportunity for redecoration, change of tenants, etc., to do some more work to insulate and improve the heat efficiency of your properties. Don't wait until it's too late and tenants are in and will have to be inconvenienced to do the work. It's more efficient to do the work while the property is empty and will ultimately save you a lot of time and money. I want to assure you that we have a brilliant team of officers in Lewisham who chase every bit of funding they can to help with this issue, and we will be ready to expand our services once the current government finally wake up to the urgency of the situation and provide local councils with the money needed to get the job done properly. I know that even with the LAD funding, this work is going to cost you a lot of money at a time when everyone is suffering with the cost of living rise. But I'm sure that as responsible landlords, you will also want to do the right thing, both for your tenants and the planet, and work with Selce and the council to create a better future for our residents. Over time, investing in your properties in this way will increase their rentable value and help keep them rented 100% of the time. I understand that LAD 2 funding applications are only open until the end of this month. So if you are eligible, I strongly urge you to apply and start this work now. But if you can't, don't worry. What the information that you will be told is that there will be another round of funding that you can apply for as well. I hope that this is helpful. If you've got any questions, it might be worth asking me now, because sadly I can't hang around for too long because I have another meeting to go to. So if anyone wants to ask me a question about the council's work, they're very welcome to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise. Just checking nobody has any questions. If so, you can pop them in the chat if you'd like to ask Louise anything now. If not, then we'll be doing questions to the Selce team right at the end. Okay, I'll move on. Hoji, would you mind moving on to my first slide, please? Just the next, yeah. Perfect, thank you. So this section is all about the importance of improving energy efficiency. So why bother? So could anybody tell me what it means to improve energy efficiency? You can pop it in the chat if you want. How much do you all know about energy efficiency? I'm hoping a little bit, and that's why you're here today.
I definitely see some familiar faces and familiar names on the Zoom. So welcome back, those of you that have attended our webinars before. Thanks for joining.
Okay. So improving energy efficiency is all about using less energy to perform the same task. So this is mainly about reducing energy loss. So for example, if you had a single glazed window and that allowed heat to escape, that wouldn't be very energy efficient. So I'm sure you've all been hearing lots about net zero and net zero carbon, or things like that. That's because the government has set a target to produce net zero greenhouse gases by 2050. So that means we need to cut down all of our emissions in order to meet this target, and that will keep global warming within a reasonable level. So what's that got to do with you? That's residential energy consumption accounts for approximately 20% of greenhouse gas emissions in the UK. So that means 1/5 of our greenhouse gases are coming from lighting our properties, heating them, cooking in them, and so on. In order to meet this goal of net zero by 2050, we need to be limiting this energy consumption. And to do this, we need to use less energy for the same tasks. And if you remember from the last slide, that's all about improving energy efficiency. Now, there's also a huge financial and social importance to this as well. So probably as you're all feeling, I know that I'm certainly feeling the effects of the increasing energy bills at the moment. It's becoming more and more expensive for us to heat our homes, power our homes, and this is your tenants as well, it's not just us. So Ofgem, for example, estimate that the average household will see their energy bills rise by nearly £700 in the next year. And that's £700 that some people just don't have. And for them, that may mean the choice between, tenants paying rent or paying to keep their lights on and food on the table. So that could mean less rent paid to you as landlords. So retrofitting your home can have significant benefits in that sense, but it can also have huge benefits to the value of your property. And that's because it makes your home a warmer and more comfortable place to live and is more attractive for tenants to live there. So investing in your property now will have many benefits for both you and your tenants. And there's also a very real importance to improving your energy efficiency of your property, and that's to a particular standard. So that standard in the UK is known as MEES, and that stands for Minimum Energy Efficiency Standard. And Nadia is going to tell you a little bit more about that in a moment.
Thanks very much for that, Jess. So before we get into the depths of retrofit and energy efficiency, there's a great sort of roundup of the why from Jess. But before we jump into the hows and whens and what exactly can you do, I wanted to find out a little bit about people that are here. How much have you sort of been looking at this area before? Have you actually done any work on your own home or on your rented properties, or not yet? And what kind of work are you looking at? So before I start asking you guys some questions, I can see that Alison has got a quick question for Councillor Kropsky. And she is saying, Councillor Kropsky said, you said it's best to do work when you don't have a tenant, but she was told that she couldn't get funding because she doesn't have a tenant at the minute, which is an interesting scenario to be in. And I think I've got some comments on that if you haven't got any too much to add on that topic, because I know that you haven't been working too closely, or maybe as much as we have, with the funding streams at the minute, Councillor Kropsky, but go ahead if you've got any.
Yeah, no, I would very much about your expertise on this, because it's obviously, see, the advice that we've done in the housing retrofit is obviously about dealing with social homes when they become voided. But yeah, I mean, I suppose there's lots of different times and moments where you could have an empty property. They could go on holiday. There could be times when your tenants are not actually in the property. It's just, obviously, if you're doing whole house retrofit, it's quite difficult to do that when your tenants are in. I do understand that, but I don't know the ins and outs of that particular part of the funding application, so I would really bow to your expertise on this, Selce. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. So it's a really interesting scenario that you've been put in, Alison, and I can see that it is quite frustrating as well. So the funding that is out at the minute, the LAD funding that we're talking about, is sort of aimed towards doing two things. The first thing is to actually improve the energy efficiency of the private rental sector housing stock. But the second part, and probably the more important part of it, is to tackle homes where people are living in fuel poverty. So where you've got tenants that are on low income, where you've got tenants that are living in cold homes, and homes that to some extent could be causing them mental health issues or physical health issues because of, you know, the comfort of the home not being as sort of energy efficient as it should be. That's where the funding comes in, and those are the people that it's trying to tackle as a first port of call. So that's why you'll find that funding is available where you've got tenants on low incomes, but not so available where you haven't got any tenants. And it is a bit of a catch-22, because you would think it makes sense to do the work when tenants are not there, but actually there are quite a few different trigger points for being able to do this work, and I'll talk about them a little bit later. But it really depends on what kinds of work you're looking to do. As Councillor Krupski mentioned, if you're looking to do a whole house refurbishment or a whole house retrofit, it's very invasive work. It's a lot to try and live around. So you do want to try and do it when the tenants are not living in the property. Having said that, a lot of us do go through refurbishments as landlords whilst the tenant is living in the property. So boiler upgrades or bathroom upgrades, kitchen upgrades, while the tenants are living there. And those are the kinds of trigger points where you want to be thinking, actually, if I'm going to take out the kitchen or take up the floor in the kitchen, now is a good time to look at that underfloor insulation, or look at those more energy efficient windows that I could be putting in whilst other building works are being done. So it's a topic that we'll touch on a little bit later as well, these trigger points. Yeah, really good question. I know that is a bit of a catch-22 if you haven't got tenants in there, but the main reason is because this funding is trying to tackle people that are living in fuel poverty, people that are sort of in the most sort of dire needs for improving the energy efficiency of the building, as well as just doing it generally for the environment. So before we jump in, quick quiz. I know we've not got too many of you on here. So Helen, Chris, Deborah, Alison and Karine, thanks all again for joining. But my first question for you guys is, have you actually taken up any work so far on your property to improve the EPC scores? And if you have, what work has it been that you've done? Or is it at the stage where you're still thinking about it, you're still looking at it, and you're still going to sort of consider what options you've got available to you? If you want to go ahead and type in the chat, feel free to that. Or if anyone does want to turn their mic on and have a chat, feel free to do that as well.
I'm happy to speak.
Yes, please go ahead, Chris.
So I've had an EcoFurb survey of my rental property. Probably will do some underfloor insulation. Because it's in a conservation area, the outside work doesn't really work on the front, so that's rather limited it. And I'll replace some windows probably as well. But the whole retrofit thing doesn't really work where you're in a conservation area and it's in Telegraph Hill, so albeit the unattractive side. Yeah, so it was interesting, but slightly a bit more limited than I thought it would be. That was my
interesting, yeah. And there's a lot of properties in Lewisham that are in those conservation areas, so I know that you're not sort of not alone in that pursuit. That's really interesting. So Alison, you're considering options at the minute. That's good to know. And Chris, how did you find that initial survey from EcoFurb? So it gave you a lot of different recommendations, I suppose. How was the process of going through the survey and the surveyor being there?
It was okay. It was a bit kind of clunky just to get it done, and in fact the guy who's done it's now leaving, so there's a slight continuity issue, but not so bad really. I think probably someone could have told me quite early on that if you're in a conservation area, you won't be able to do the whole retrofit thing. That might have been useful to know, but the other stuff is useful anyway. So no, it's okay. The other issue now, which I'm about to discuss, is whether the work, if I wanted EcoFurb to manage the work, whether the work is actually of sufficient value for EcoFurb to be interested in doing it. I'm waiting to have that conversation, but it would be a bit annoying if it turned out that it wasn't. But we'll see.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. So we've worked a lot with EcoFurb in the past, and EcoFurb are an organisation that will do you a whole house assessment or a whole house plan, and then allocate a retrofit coordinator, someone qualified in retrofit, to manage that whole process for you. So work with actually getting vetted contractors on board and take them from the beginning of planning all of the different steps through to implementing every step that there is. So just before we jump into it again, Alison is asking how much the survey was, Chris, and what a retrofit is. So we'll talk about what a retrofit is in just a minute, but how much was the survey, Chris, out of interest, if you're happy with your numbers? No worries if not.
If I could remember, I'd show that I was a better landlord. I suspect it was about 250 quid, but please don't budget on that, because I'm not sure. I think it was about 250 quid.
All right, brilliant. I think that sounds about right. I think they might have gone up to 290 or 295 now, but somewhere around that price range. Okay, let's jump straight into it, shall we, if there's no more questions from the floor. And I think Councillor Krupski might be dropping off somewhere mid-webinar. So if you've got any more questions for her, do just pop them in the chat, and then we will shoot them over to her afterwards and ask her to get back to you directly on them. So legislation and guidance. Who's heard of minimum energy efficiency standards? Please let me know in the chat. Yes or no? Heard of it? Never heard of it? So is there anyone that's never heard of it? Heard of it? Heard of it? Okay, brilliant. So I would hope that everyone's heard of it, because it's one of the key standards that impacts whether or not you can actually rent your property out. So a few people haven't heard of it. All right. So minimum energy efficiency standards are standards that have been set at a national level. And they essentially say that every property that is rented out needs to comply with a minimum level of EPC score. So at the moment, the EPC score, the minimum that you have to be is E. Energy performance certificates, or EPCs, will rate your property from an A to a G based on how energy efficient it is. And when a surveyor will come and assess your EPC score, they'll go through your building and they'll look at different aspects of the building. So they'll look at things like what kind of lighting you've got in the property, what kind of heating systems, what kind of insulation you've got in the property. And all of those bits of data are put together to then spit out a number which gives you a score from A to G. The certificate will also give you recommendations as to what improvements you can make to jump up different EPC score bands. But the main thing that it gives you is a letter, and the minimum that you have to have reached to rent out your property at the minute is an E. So any property that has an EPC score of F or G is not currently meeting the MEES standards, and those are legal requirements to actually rent out a property. EPC scores also need to be improved over time. So the government actually has a target of making the minimum standards C by 2030. So year on year, they're going to keep going up. They have been going up over time, but the aim is EPC C by 2030. So we need to always bear that in mind. And when you're looking at retrofit, try and look at how many bands you can jump to meet that EPC C by 2030, so that you're prepared for that in future, and you don't have to keep sort of laying out for a little bit of work done this year, a little bit of work done next year, a little bit more work done the year after. It's much easier, much more time efficient and cost efficient to do it all in one go. So there's a second piece of legislation which is slightly related to energy efficiency, but I suppose not in a direct manner. and that is for short the HHSRS. Now, this is a very long acronym that stands for Healthy Homes Safety Regulation Standard, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, rest of the team, because I always forget what this one is called. But this essentially takes into account how healthy a property is to live in and how safe it is to live in for the tenants. So this will take into account all sorts of aspects, from fire safety to excess cold to various other bits. So when you look at whether a property is safe and healthy and habitable for tenants, the HHSRS is probably the more common legislation that we see come up. Often the way that properties get reported to the council for not complying with HHSRS is there'll be either sort of a fire service or social workers or other organisations that will see that the property is below standards and then report it to the council. The council will then come and do an assessment of the property, and they will put different hazards or different problems in different categories based on how severe they are for the habitation and for the health of the tenant that is living there. So there's two core areas, and what the reason I wanted to talk about HHSRS really is because one of the hazards, which can be quite a strong hazard, is excess cold, and that is very, very closely linked to energy efficiency. So where you can improve the energy efficiency of your property, it's always good to try and stay away from that excess cold hazard. Can we jump on to the next slide, please, Hoji? Thank you. So we've had a look at the legislation, and I don't want to get too focused on legislation because I know that as landlords, we always hear about a lot of legislation. We always hear about, you know, what criteria have to be met to rent out the property to tenants. But we don't always hear about what the practical solutions are for actually meeting these criteria and these legislation. And as you guys are on this webinar, I'm sure that a lot of you are already taking on those responsibilities and are, you know, very concerned with actually trying not just to meet the minimum criteria, but to go above that and create a comfortable environment for your tenants to live in. So some of the practical solutions that I want to talk about include, we break it down into 4 different areas usually. When we talk about retrofit, we're talking about making old properties better insulated and more fit for the future, essentially. So doing work on an existing property that will make it more energy efficient is what retrofit in its broadest sense means. When people talk about retrofit, sometimes they'll be talking about the whole process of retrofitting a whole property. And that is an approach that's taken by a lot of people within the industry because they think it is best to tackle a building as a whole and to tackle all the issues in one go. And we'll touch on why that can be a good method, but it's not always the practical method, and it's not always the most practical way to go for most people. But there are 4 key areas of energy efficiency that I want to touch on today. Those are thinking about heating systems, how the property loses heat, if you can generate renewable energy, and finally, the energy efficiency of your appliances and any smart home appliances. Now, these are 4 important areas because that's how we can think about that's how we can break down energy efficiency in our heads into those key areas, because energy efficiency is a very, very big topic. There are lots of different areas that you can dig very deep into. But I think breaking it down with these 4 chunks makes it quite manageable. If you can go on to the next slide, Hoji. Thank you very much. So just focusing specifically on losing heat, because that's where most of the practical solutions come in terms of what we can do in terms of major work to our property and major works to improve the EPC score. They tend to be around either putting solar panels on, upgrading your heating system, or looking at insulation. 4 key areas for insulation. The first one you want to focus on is actually the one that's at the bottom of this slide. So your windows and your draft proofing. Thermal efficiency of windows tends to be, less than a third of the efficiency of walls. So you can imagine you lose most of your heat through your windows. So if you haven't got double glazing or triple glazing yet, definitely something you want to look at as a first step. Draft proofing, another important one, and it's important because this is a really cheap solution and we really love cheap solutions. So looking at where you can actually close up gaps around the edges of windows, where you can close up gaps around that old letterbox that you've got that lets all the air in, gaps between floorboards and similar. They are a significant source of heat loss and a cheap one to fix. You've also then got roof and loft insulation as the second sort of place that loses the most heat from the building. So if your property doesn't have loft insulation or roof insulation, again, this is one of the really cheap, really low-hanging fruits of energy efficiency to solve this issue. Third place to look at would be your walls. So have you got cavity walls or have you got solid walls, and what kind of insulation can go with those walls? So Chris was talking about his property being in a conservation area and not being able to do, I assume, external works on the property, which would have been external wall insulation, because he's got a solid wall property. Solid wall properties obviously are a bit harder to tackle because you've only got one wall and then you have to stick the insulation either on the inside or on the outside. Whereas with the cavity walls, which are usually found in newer properties, you can pop the insulation down the middle. But of course, there's always caveats to this. You want to make sure that you insulate tight and ventilate right to make sure that you don't have any issues with your insulation like damp and condensation. But don't let those sort of scare stories pull you away from insulating. No, insulation is always a good option as long as you make sure you think about ventilation at the same time. And finally, floor insulation. Floor is where we actually lose the least heat from in a building in comparison to the other areas. But if you've got a lot of floor space, if you've got sort of suspended floorboards that do get a lot of air under them, it is something that you want to have to think about as well. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about the Future Fit Homes service. Future Fit Homes was set up by South East London Community Energy actually relatively recently. As an organisation, we were primarily focused on helping people with their energy bills and helping make sure that no one's left behind on that energy transition. But we realised that actually a lot of people who aren't necessarily struggling with their bills do want to do something about making their properties greener and more efficient, and that included, of course, landlords. So the service was set up to be a trustworthy and impartial service. We don't work with contractors, so we're not trying to sell you anything that contractors would encourage you to install for various other reasons. And we're also members of Retrofit Works Cooperative, which is a cooperative of local contractors that are vetted and trusted in the area. All of the income that we get off of this programme goes back into our fuel poverty alleviation work and into supporting schools and community buildings go green with solar panels and LED lighting. Next slide, please, Hoji. So we've got a number of services. If you're interested in sort of having one of our advisors come to your property and have a look at it, one-to-one advice is the best option. If you've got, direct questions and very specific questions about your property, that's charged at £59 an hour. And our retrofit coordinators will literally come and look at what your issues are within your property. Or maybe you've got quotes back from contractors and you want to know, are they within a good range? What should I be looking out for? And bits like that within those quotes, then you can send it to our team and we'll have a look at that for an hourly rate. I can see that Councillor Kropsky is needing to leave now, but yes, if you've got any more questions for her, do let us know. And thank you for joining, Councillor Kropsky. There's also a various other services that we do, so feel free to go ahead and have a look at our website. We've got a lot of free content on there as well, previous webinars that we've run that really dig a lot deeper into retrofit and energy efficiency than I will today. So that is futurefithomes.org. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is one of our services which was really popular over the winter. It's our thermal imaging surveys. So this one's quite interactive. If you want to know exactly where your home is leaking heat from, let us know you're interested in thermal imaging, and we will come and do this next winter for you now. So yeah, just missed the boat for that. It's just started getting a little bit too warm, which I'm not complaining about at all. But it's a really fun service that we run. Next slide, please, Hoji. And then these are just some of the events that we've run in the past. So if you've been interested in heat pumps, or you've sort of had a think about insulation and little bits like that, but don't know where to start, these webinars are all recorded, all available for free online, so you can go ahead and check those out. Next slide, please. Thank you. Positive reviews speak for themselves. I won't speak about this too much. If we can go on to the next slide again, Hoji. Thank you. So there's a number of different motives for retrofitting your building. Jess talked about the ones that we think are specific to landlords in the beginning, but I've put down a few here. And the last one I want to talk about is increased value, and it's got a question mark on it. The reason it's got a question mark on it is because trying to prove that improving your energy efficiency does increase the value of your property at the minute, to be honest, is a bit of a tough task to do. But when it comes to rented properties, we do obviously see that the energy performance certificate is something that is advertised on every single Zoopla and Rightmove listing. And you can see that when you go on Zoopla and when you go on Rightmove straight away. So we do know that tenants are looking at more and more the costs of bills and running their property or managing their household when they're looking at renting properties. As for increasing the value of the asset itself, there's lots of research being done around how much energy efficiency impacts this, but there's still lots of issues like location and like the style of the property that obviously hold a lot more weight than the energy efficiency of it. But we think that this is going to be increasing in the future due to different financial tools like green mortgages that give people easier access to actually purchasing the property if they're working on green measures. Next slide, please. A few of the limiting factors, again, so this is what Chris was talking about earlier with him being in a conservation area. There's lots of limiting factors to what you can do with your building and your retrofit, conservation areas being one of them, so not being able to change the look of the outside of your property. Planning rules, building regulations, restrictions, who your neighbours are. If your property is adjoined to another property, you need to think about a Party Wall Act when you change the structure of your property. So always trying to maintain those positive relationships with neighbours can be very helpful in this space. And of course, there's a lot of practical and technical restrictions as well. So when you start on what I would say is major works in retrofit, so if you're looking at changing the construction of the property, if you're looking at large scale insulation, you do want to get experts involved, at least for that first look, and at least to give you an idea about what the potential limiting factors are here within the works that you're doing. Next slide, please, Hoji. And how do you actually plan for doing a retrofit? Well, we would recommend that you take something called the fabric first approach. The fabric first approach basically says that before you start adding things on top, so you might be interested in actually putting in a heat pump, or you might be interested in looking at solar panels, the best solution for financially actually and for your carbon emissions is to think about how much energy the building uses in the beginning to heat it up, or how much energy it uses on electricity to power it. So when we talk about fabric first, we're actually saying the best energy saved is the energy that's not used in the beginning. So rather than putting in a heat pump to generate new types of heating, you're better off insulating the house first, making sure that the air tightness is as good as it can be and the ventilation levels are right before you start implementing all of these new technologies to generate more energy. You also want to think about, when you're looking at retrofit, what is the most urgent thing? What is the most short-term solution? And then you want to look at the medium-term solutions and the long-term solutions as well. And if you want to get a retrofit coordinator on board to think about these plans, I think that is a brilliant idea. Just so you can think about what are all the options that are available to me, so that you can have that advice. You know, as Chris was talking about earlier, someone could have told him from the beginning, if you're in a conservation area, this probably won't be available to you, and this probably will be available to you. So yeah, think about it as we would recommend, think about it as the whole of the house, and make a plan that is short, medium and long term, so that you're not doubling up on different areas, so that you're not missing out opportunities where you could have had work done when it coincided with other building works that were being doing, and you don't have to, for example, take up your floorboards once to do the kitchen and a second time round to do the underfloor insulation. So it's about taking all of these different aspects of building work into account. Next slide, please, Hoji. And the main focus is actually just make sure that your existing building fabric is fixed before you look at adding new things in. So we talked a little bit earlier about when we've heard about poor installations on cavity wall insulation or on loft insulation. If you have got issues with your property that you've seen before on the insulation, the best thing you can do is fix that before you get started on putting new insulation in. And as we mentioned earlier, build airtight and insulate right. So trying to reduce the amount of heat that you need or the amount of energy that you need to heat your property up is a good place to start. And then you can think about adding the supplementary energy sources like renewable energy and heat pumps and solar panels, etc. Next slide, please, Hoji. So these are some of this is practically what some of the solutions look like. So this is external wall insulation, which we were talking about for solid brick wall properties. Two solutions here are external, so put the insulation on the outside or put the insulation on the inside, internal wall insulation. You can see here that this project, the before is the left hand or the top picture, and the after is the bottom picture. You really can't see much difference at all in the property. And for that reason, this property didn't need any planning permission when it was having the external wall insulation done. Now, if you do live in an area where you've got a few more restrictions on the look of your property, like the conservation areas, this is something that you need to take into account in much more detail. But there are solutions out there for different scenarios where you can work around the sort of look of the property and the feel of the property. Next slide, please, Soji. So this is the same thing, but done internally. The difference is when you do this internally, you're not losing, or you are kind of losing a little bit of space on the inside of your property. So you're looking at about sort of between 5 and 10 centimeters off of the inside of each wall, if you're looking at internal wall insulation, dependent on what fabric you use. Obviously, when you're doing it on the outside, it doesn't make much of a difference because you're not losing space from inside your rooms. But inside, it is something that you want to think about. Next slide, please. Ground floors, a tough one to tackle because it does mean taking up the flooring, but there are different solutions here again. One of the most popular ones that I've heard our retrofit coordinators talk about is a robot that goes under your floors. So you only need to take one floorboard up, send the robot under, and it will spray the insulation under suspended wooden floorboards. So there's lots of different solutions out there, but yeah, if you're looking at major works like this, I would highly recommend at least sort of a few hours of chatting to a retrofit coordinator. Next slide, please. And these are the suspended floorboards that I was talking about. So you can see where the robot would run under these floors. There is quite a big gap. But here they have put in some insulation at a higher level than the really big gap under the floorboards, and created some beds for that insulation to lay here. Next slide, please, Hoji. So there's lots of different solutions. I've focused today mainly on the insulation because that's one of the solutions that we think is the first step really when you're talking about retrofit as a whole. But if you're interested in looking at solar PV, if you're interested in looking at heat pumps, improving your heating systems, often we find a lot of properties in Lewisham don't actually have any central heating to begin with. Then do get in touch with us and we will see firstly what practical solutions are out there for you, but secondly what funding you might be able to apply to if your tenants are in the right sort of income brackets. Okay, next slide please, Hoji. So I'm going to pass on now to Hoji to run us through the different funding opportunities, which I'm sure you've all been waiting for, and he can tell you a little bit more about eligibility criteria and the process for actually applying.
So I'm sure you guys heard LAD 2 being mentioned. Just going to sum it up and just give sort of a brief introduction to it. So what is it? It's the Local Authority Delivery Scheme Phase 2, which is essentially a government scheme designed to tackle fuel poverty in energy inefficient homes. Its aim is to help make fuel poor homes more energy efficient, saving money for landlords, tenants, and homeowners. And having an energy efficient home would allow for less use of gas and electricity, thereby reducing carbon emissions, which is sort of the big grand goal at the end of the day. And the scheme would also aid in job growth for the green energy sector and help spread both knowledge and awareness of energy saving measures and its effects, which you've been exposed to today. So that's sort of a general brief overview of what it is. So eligibility wise, 2 criteria stand out. So for private landlords, your property must have an EPC of band D or below, and your tenant's combined household income must be below £30,000. And in terms of funding, the landlord must contribute 1/3 of the total amount. So I will give you an example here. So £5,000 is the total maximum amount that the government will sort of grant, and the landlord will have to add 2,500 on top of the grant, so making the total sum £7,500. And this sum would be directly funded, or will be used to sort of directly fund the improvements to the property. So the funding process, so if you are eligible and if you do qualify, so we can apply on your behalf, provided that you and your tenants fit the criteria. We will then be referring you to Warmworks, who are a partnership based in Scotland, funnily enough, chosen by the government to lead the LAD 2 project. So we would register you, and then Warmworks will be in contact with you for sort of further details regarding eligibility. So we would also do a general survey on your property around this time, highlighting sort of areas to improve. If you already sort of don't really know, you know, where improvements can be, like we would help sort of give you advice on that. And as we've covered, improvements may include sort of cavity wall or solid wall insulation, loft or roof insulation, double or triple glazed windowing, and even sort of in the installation of renewable sources of energy, solar panels, or air sourced or ground or hydro source heat pumps, for example. And so once improvements have been agreed upon, Warmworks would hire proven contractors to begin work on your property. And of course, this is sort of a simple explanation of the roadmap. Like every sort of project will be different depending on the individual circumstance. So just bear that in mind. And I'm going to briefly touch upon LAD 3 funding. As you may know now, that LAD 2 referring ends at the end of this month, which is, I would say, 4 days away. So not too long to go now. But LAD 3 applications will begin April 1st, so right around the corner. And the criterion for eligibility is slightly different with LAD 3. So while the aims are the same, aiding tackling fuel poverty in energy inefficient homes, properties with an EPC band of E and below will be sort of prioritized, while EPC band properties of D can still apply, but they'll be sort of in the back of the list for this. And the income threshold would also change. It will be reduced. So tenants or homeowners must have a combined household income of below £20,000 this time around. And it will be led by retrofit works instead of warm works. So they were sort of given the funds for LAD 3. So that's just a brief overview of that. And alternative funding. So if you're not eligible, if you don't sort of fit or your tenants fit the criteria, there are alternative funding sort of available. So the Energy Company Obligation, or ECO scheme, is sort of another government scheme, which is aimed mostly at homes without adequate heating. So that could be boiler replacement or placing gas boilers with electric boilers. I think over half of what they've already done has to do with heating and boilers and that sort of thing. There's also loans and remortgaging. So some banks, for example, have green home loan schemes with low rates. So you can sort of look into that as well. And obviously we have self-funding, which is pretty self-explanatory. So if you have the funds available and you know what sort of you want to do to make your home more energy efficient or your property, there's always that option too. So I think I've just covered most, or if not all, the funding types.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Oji. If anyone has any questions, please go ahead and jump in. You can either pop them in the chat or just turn on your microphone and let us know what your questions are. But you can see that there is a range of funding available. Criteria is quite specific and quite, I guess, restrictive in some ways. But there are some variations available to that threshold as well, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, Hoji, but I understand that the threshold for the total income should be either below £30,000 or below £20,000 after housing costs are deducted.
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah.
So let's say you've got a property where your tenants are actually earning £50,000 in total, but the rent is £2,000 or £2,500 per month. That would bring their housing costs, their income after their housing costs, to below £20,000. So they would still be eligible. So when we're talking about what kind of tenants would be sort of eligible for this funding, it would mainly be sort of either tenants that have no or low income, which we would say are students, pensioners who've got, you know, significant savings but possibly a low income each month from their pension, or it's probably families with kids who are, renting out properties that are sort of 2 to 3 bedrooms but don't have a massive annual income. Maybe it's one parent or it is 2 parents working on lower salaried jobs. So they're the kinds of tenants that we're talking about being eligible for this funding. Alison had a question. For the eco funding, do you have to have tenants currently in the property? Hoji, could you take that one for us?
So I don't think so, but you would have to have a boiler. So let's say if you wanted to replace a boiler, you would only have to have the faulty boiler. Let's say if you don't have a boiler, that is one of the criteria, but I would need to double check on that for sure. Get back to Alison on that question.
Okay, so for the eco funding, they would need to have a faulty boiler or no boiler at all?
A faulty boiler. So if they didn't have a boiler,
boiler.
that would be where the problem lies. It's only if you had a faulty boiler.
Oh, right.
No boiler
Noted.
at all. It's yeah, you're not eligible. It's a strange one.
Okay, thank you. All right, so Alison says that she has got a boiler that doesn't work. So Alison, if you can get in touch with us, what you can actually do is book a call with us on our website. So I'm just going to type the web address in now, but we've got a page specifically for landlords in Lewisham. And there's a form that you can fill out on that website, which will come straight to us. And it's got a few questions about where your properties are, how many you've got, and what EPC rating you've got. And then we'll book in a call. We'll give you a ring back and sit down and have that conversation with you directly. And that service is completely free. If you're a landlord in Lewisham, it's not something that you have to pay for. So Helen is asking, for LAD 2 funding, is there an EPC level requirement? Hoji, is there an EPC level requirement?
Yes,
for
so
LAD 2?
So it's band D or below. Anything above D, you're unfortunately automatically not eligible. But for LAD 2, it's band D and below.
Okay, brilliant. And so LAD 2 ends at the end of this month, which is Thursday. How does it change for LAD 3, the minimum EPC requirement?
So with that, it's E and below. Band D can apply. Properties, landowners with band D can apply, but they won't be prioritized, unfortunately. I feel like this is a more targeted scheme by the government, trying to get to sort of the far end of fuel poverty.
All right, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so key message here is if you think you might be eligible, or any landlords that you think might be eligible, get their application in as soon as you can. Book that call with us as soon as you can, so that we can try and apply for the less stringent of the 2 funding streams before the end of the month.
Can I just jump in now?
Go ahead, please do.
Yeah, I mean, I think my property probably is band D. It hasn't been had the EPEC done, I don't know, for the last few years, but is it too late to actually apply? I take what you're saying about it ends on Thursday. Could I get an application in now?
I think you could. So does your property have an EPC that was done in the past 10 years?
Yes, which is a D.
Perfect. Then yes, you can apply if your tenants meet the right criteria.
Yeah, they do. They do.
Lovely. So yeah, Helen, we will make sure to pick up with you and book you in for a call tomorrow or the day after, and we can go through that application with you. Brilliant. Okay, I think we are coming sort of to the end of the session. We've run over time a little bit here. We are gonna stop the recording there.